All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here with us. My name is Rebecca Hughes. I'm the Executive Deputy Director of the Canal Corporation and also serving as the moderator for this afternoon. Without further ado, we'll get started, and I will ask Canal Corporation Director Brian Stratton to come to the podium to kick us off. Thank you.
That was the slide that I need. Perfect. Okay. Move the box to the other side. Good, good. Excellent. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to all of you who are with us this afternoon at Mohawk Valley Community College on the beautiful Rome campus. And thank you for those online who are joining us live stream. My name is Brian Stratton. I am the Director of the Canal Corporation and the appointed Task Force Chair of Governor Hochul's Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force. I am pleased to welcome members of the task force, those members who have traveled to Rome to join us in person, and those who are joining us virtually by the online connection. And it's my job to introduce our members here and who are online, as well as special guests and others who have joined with us this afternoon. So with us today from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation as members of our task force, virtually and online. And if they don't wave to you, it's a good guess that they're probably online. So because all this changes. Dareth Galantz, the Regional Director of DEC Region Number 7, Kelly Higgins Roche, Tim Walsh, and Tom Snow. Tom is here. On behalf of DEC Interim Commissioner Sean Mahar. From the New York State Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services is Heather Grohl. Heather is here. She's waving. Thank you, Heather. And Heather is here on behalf of DHSES Commissioner Jackie Bray. Thank you, Heather. From the New York State Department of Transportation, Joe Leathersich is online. And Joe is here representing DOT Commissioner Marie-Therese Dominguez. And though not assigned as members of the task force, we are also pleased to have with us today Keisha Santiago, and I believe Keisha is probably joining us virtually because Keisha was on a meeting in Albany at 1 o'clock. I know from personal experience, there's no legal way to get to Rome in just 1 hour. Unless we have wings. Kate Black is also here. Kate, thank you. They are both from the New York State Department of State, and they have some information to share with us today relative to upstate flood mitigation. Subject matter experts were also appointed to the task force by the governor, the Senate, and the Assembly. And here with us in person, under those appointee categories, Bill Neckerman and Peter Nichols. Thank you, Bill and Peter. Attending virtually, Ravi Ravindra from Rochester area engineering firm, and unfortunately also task force member Owen Murray had an emergency come up, so he was unable to join with us today. Professor Ted McDrenny is conducting research remotely, and he is unable to be with us today. We're also joined by a number of individuals that we're very happy to have. We're very happy to have all of you here, but I want to specifically recognize that we are joined by Senator Joe Griffo. Senator, wave so we can all see you. Thank you. And Assembly Member Marianne Buttonshaw. Assembly Member, thank you so much for being with us. We're also being joined virtually by a member of Senator John Mannion's staff. We are also being joined virtually, I understand, by Assembly Member Al Sturpey and Robert Smullen. Both assembly members. Oh, I'm sorry, assembly member, thank you.
Brian Miller.
I'm sorry, Assemblyman Miller, Brian Miller, thank you. We thank you for being here, and we thank you for your support and for the legislature's support. I also want to recognize we have Utica Mayor Mike Galami's Chief of Staff. Mike is here with us. Thank you, Mike. And I'm sure I've missed some of you. Would you like to say hello? Dolores Caruso and from the governor's regional office. I'm sorry. I would also like to note that we have many municipalities, lake associations, community groups, and environmental advocates with us today, including those from the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for joining us today. And last but certainly not least, I want to welcome members of the public who are with us from across both the Oswego River Basin and the Mohawk River Basin. Please know that it is your advocacy that has gotten us to this point, and we look forward to sharing with you the tremendous work that we have accomplished since we met a year ago. And I would also be remiss if I did not thank our Canal Corporation staff and the staff here at Mohawk Valley Community College who have arranged for the logistics for today's meeting. And it has been almost a year since we were here. And in the interim, we have published our report. We have submitted the required report to Governor Hochul just about a year ago. And printed copies of those reports are here with you as you checked in. And I see we've just been joined by Assemblymember Sturpey. Thank you, Assemblymember, for coming in. I want to tell you that it has been extremely important work that we have done. And I say that not only as the chair of the task force, but as a former mayor for 8 years along the canal in Schenectady. I certainly am well familiar with what we have undertaken and with the challenges that all of our canal communities, both along the Oswego River Basin and the Mohawk River Basin, endure and what they are met with every time. So we are committed to that work going forward. And although this marks the last official public meeting of the task force, we want to continue the dialogue, and we will continue that and to be here for you. Also that we have the right IAT support. We have wonderful IAT support to enable all of our virtual connections. And the owl that's going back and forth here, when you talk, the owl follows you. So we will be recording. And with that, I would like to call back up to the podium the moderator for today's meeting, Executive Deputy Director Rebecca Hughes. Come back up, Rebecca.
Thank you, Brian. And again, welcome. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to go through some very quick housekeeping and logistics items, and then we're going to dive into what I would say is kind of a whirlwind overview of the work of the task force. And then we'll spend the vast majority of our time talking about progress that's made over the last 12 months. A lot of the folks in the room, whether you're a homeowner who's been affected by flooding or a member of the legislature who's really advocated and shown very strong, fast, decisive action on advancing some of the priorities identified by the task force, you've all played a part in helping us to get to where we are today. So although the task force is providing the update, this is something that I hope everyone feels some ownership in, because it really has been a strong, bipartisan, universally supported effort, and we hope to keep that momentum going forward until we've done everything we can to mitigate flooding in these regions. I'll note that for those that are present in the room, we've got exits in both directions, so just look for the illuminated signs if anything should occur. If an alarm goes off, please make note of how to exit the building. Restrooms are out the door and to the right. Please make sure that you've signed in if you hadn't done that on your way in the door. As Brian noted, there's hard copies of the report available there as well. And of course, online. And the way that I find it is Googling Upstate Mitigation Flood Task Force, and it is the first link that arises. So you can find materials there. So just to very quickly recap the legislation and the mandate of the task force. Let me minimize the screen. Oops, I skipped ahead. So the legislation that empowered us to conduct the task force was actually not new in 2022. It had been, brought forward and passed as law at least once before, proposed several times. And I think what was a real key differentiator for this law that we've, been working in honor of over the past year is that it named the Canal Corporation as the chairperson. So it helps to have someone named as being responsible for delivering on the mandate. It also limited the scope of the task force to the watersheds through which the canal passes most predominantly. So that's the Oswego River Basin and the Mohawk River Basin, as everyone is familiar. The task force was brought together first on July 1st of 2022 and was required to deliver its report and recommendations by July 1 of 2023. The report was submitted and published that day. And the task force was asked to consider the cost of the impact of flooding across the whole range of economic sectors over the past 5 years. We also looked at a few of the bigger flood events that occurred outside of that 5-year window. The economic sectors are listed here, ranging from agriculture, transportation, impacts on infrastructure or land use, public health. Certainly insurance claims were a big part of that economic analysis. Tourism impacts were another large area of impact, recreation and power generation. After we assessed those quantitative or monetary impacts of flooding, we also assessed the canal system and its operation, what could be done to modify the way this navigation system operates in order to provide better flood mitigation. So that was investigated, and that all resulted in a list of adaptive measures and recommendations. And the legislation also required that we hold public sessions at least 4 times throughout that 1-year period. Many of you were in this room with us just about a year ago. And then the legislation also required that we meet again to provide an update within 1 year of the submission of that report. So that's what brings us here today. I'm very pleased that we had a lot of content to report out on. And again, this is a testament to great work that has begun. A whole lot of work is still ahead of us. So we're excited to think ahead about where we're going to go from here as we start to conduct studies and create new numeric models and establish our basis of data to go forward. One other housekeeping note, I put in Shane Mahar's email address on a few of the slides. So for those that are attending the webinar portion but are not presenters, we had a Zoom bombing experience last year that meant we had to really tighten up our security on our web experiences. Unfortunately, this really limits our ability to interact and unmute and use the chat function. So for those of you that are just on listen only mode through the live stream, please email Shane with questions. I put his email address on several slides throughout, and then when we get to the Q&A at the end, I also listed his email address there very predominantly. We will hold questions until the end. We'll go through slide materials fairly quickly and then reserve plenty of time for discussion. We're also able to stay after 4 p.m. if people want to stay and discuss, or to set up one-on-one meetings or meetings with your lake association or community at your request. So in terms of our whirlwind overview, I've often said this is a tale of 2 watersheds. Across the Mohawk River Basin, which is about 3,400 square miles, you'll see a lot of elevation change, very fast moving floodwaters with very substantial damages that occur very quickly as that water infiltrates and then leaves in very rapid fashion. The Oswego River Basin, over 5,000 square miles in size, is characterized by its lack of elevation. My colleague Ken Kemp will speak about this momentarily, but really defined by slow-moving floodwaters that persist for a very long time. The waters rise slowly and they certainly dissipate very slowly. So 2 very traumatizing experiences with flooding, very different flood characteristics. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ken, who's going to provide a little bit more of a technical overview of water management across each basin, and then we'll move into recommendations after that.
Thanks, Rebecca. As you mentioned, the Mohawk River Basin is quite large. It's the largest tributary to the Hudson River. And anyone that lives along it knows that the flooding occurs in a very fast manner. Characterizations of this basin is on the right-hand side of this slide. You can see the two yellow dots, Delta Reservoir and Hinkley Reservoir, the two main water control structures on the Mohawk. There is no real flood mitigation potential along the stream itself. The black dots show you a few of the hydroelectric plants that are on tributaries that have some control, but limited by their FERC licenses. And on the bottom of that same map, you can see where Glenheim Gilboa Reservoir and Dam is the pump storage facility that NYPA owns that is on Schoharie Creek, which is the major tributary to the Mohawk, which comes in upstream of Schenectady. As Rebecca mentioned, the Mohawk River is fairly steep. It moves fairly quickly. The canal itself is built mainly on the main stem of the Mohawk. There are some plate locations where we bifurcate from the Mohawk River, where the lock is adjacent to the Mohawk River. There's a canal section that bypasses that, but in general, it flows along the Mohawk River. Many of the locations, as you can see, where you see the letters NB, that's a movable dam. The structures that you see along the thruway as you drive up, large green structures that are taken out of the water outside of navigation season, that are put down into the water this time of year so that the pools can be filled for the navigation. As far as the Oswego Basin goes, as Rebecca said, it is a larger basin. The key being, you can see that there are 7 Finger Lakes included in the Oswego Basin, as well as Onondaga Lake in Syracuse and Oneida Lake are fully contained within this system. The big issue with the Oswego River Basin is water control. The orange dots that you see are controlled by others, lake associations, municipalities, water companies, things of that nature. The black dots that you see are controls that hydroelectric companies have coming out of the Seneca Lake as well as Owasco Lake. And the yellow dots are where Canal has control, which is what's known as Mudlock at CS1 on the Cayuga-Seneca Canal at the end of the northern end of Cayuga Lake, as well as the outlet to Oneida Lake. This is a very flat area, and the controls lakes are governed by rule curves, which were put in place in the 70s, 60s, and 70s for recreational purposes. They keep it within a certain bandwidth during the elevation bandwidth during the summer for recreational purposes. Most of them are dropped down slightly in the winter to allow for the spring freshet and to provide some storage in the spring when the runoff comes. The key to this basin is it's flat, very flat. The distance from CS1 that I mentioned at the end of Cayuga Lake to Baldwinsville, which is the next lock and dam downstream at Lock E24, is roughly 30 miles, and you've got less than 2 feet of elevation difference. So it is very, very slow moving. When there's a flood in that area, it covers a wide distance, and it takes a long time to get out of there. Baldwinsville is currently the biggest, I don't want to say hold up, but we have one container gate that can be operated on Baldwinsville, and that is the only way we can allow water out of that system without raising the elevation to go over the dam. So that's one of the key points of the task force was looking at Baldwinsville.
Okay. And the final section of our presentation will be to go through the various notes of progress that have occurred over the past year. A few of us will cover the various slides, and then we'll open things up for discussion. So please, jot down your questions, use the email if you have a question from online, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion.
We were able to submit the report on time, July 1st of last year. In that report, we had 9 recommended adaptive measures that that the task force came up with that are can be related to both basins. Floodplain restoration, a big one. A lot of development has occurred along the canal and the river system that has taken floodplain away from its intended uses. Regulatory reforms to improve agency coordination. There is no ongoing discussion at this point in time to when someone does a release. Like I mentioned, in the Oswego Basin, they're governed by the rule curves. They don't look at what happens downstream. That's not part of what their mandate is. And the task force recommended that some kind of group be formed to start working on those during high flow events so that the discussion can occur before the flooding happens. Reducing development in the floodplain. I think all of us that live in the floodplain or have lived in the floodplain know that you're in for an interesting time and we're trying to reduce development in those areas so that people don't have those problems in the future. And then a mandate on property disclosures. Anybody that's bought a house in a floodplain, you may not have been made aware of it before you bought the house. The property disclosures at the time of the report didn't require that. So that was something very different that was recommended, and we'll speak to that a little bit later. 4 specific recommendations for the Mohawk Basin. Updates to the flood maps. Canal Corporation in 2019 changed how we operate the movable dams in the summer. They're actually removed from the, they're actually raised in advance of major storm events that are predicted. We need 72 hours to get them out of the water, but if we have a 72-hour advance notice, we take those out and reduce the flooding. The FEMA flood mapping in those areas was not updated. We did a small section around Amsterdam for Guy Park Manor. We took a number of houses out of the floodplain just using that, applying that regulation. Modernization, those movable dams, again, 72 hours removed. 24 hours notice to mariners to get off the river before we raise them. And it takes us roughly 48 hours to raise all the movable dams out of the way. So it's very time consuming. They're 1800s technology. They're really not used anyplace else in the world. Look at modernizing them. How can we get them out of the water faster? Ice mitigation, anybody in Bishop Ferry, Schenectady, that area knows ice mitigation is a huge issue. That's where a majority of the flooding comes from. We'll speak to that a little bit later as well. Operational adjustments in key locations. We only have a couple reservoirs that we can use. Hinkley Reservoir is operated on a curve based on output for the hydropower because of hydropower at the dam and downstream. It looks like an eye chart. It's very difficult to change anything. Delta Reservoir, is there an opportunity to modify how Delta Reservoir is operated in the summer? That's one of the things to be looked at. And there were 5 specific to the Mohawk Basin. I'm sorry, Oswego. Yes, again, because of all of the reservoirs and all of the different operating companies, we restated the need for water management. Study of modifications of canal infrastructure, especially at Baldwinsville. What can be done at Baldwinsville to allow water out faster without impacting downstream, but improving all the way up to Q Reservoir and obviously including Cross Lake. Property buyouts. There is chronic flooding through the Cross Lake area and downstream. Is there the opportunity to do buyouts for people that would like to leave those areas? Something else we will talk about. And then restoration of the seasonal floodplains. Working with DC, Tom Snow, we came up with, there's over 1,000 acres out by Montezuma Wildlife Refuge, between the Wildlife Refuge and the Wildlife Management Area, that is floodplain that's been disconnected. We recommend, the task force recommended that it be looked at to purchase that, to put it back to restore it to floodplain, to restore it to wetlands, to try and do some natural floodplain restoration. And to those folks in the legislature here, thank you. The numeric modeling, the one thing, the overarching effort that we were looking for to start everything. The state has appropriated $1.5 million, roughly $750,000 per basin, Mohawk and the Oswego. This was part of Governor Hochul's funding. Interstated the state. The 2 groups introduced the funding bill in a one-house budget bill, meaning it was basically agreed to before it went through. It was not part of the negotiations for the budget this year. So we have now been awarded that money and have access to it. We are in the process of writing the RFP, the request for proposals for a firm to do this work for us. We'll talk, Tom and I will both discuss the Mohawk in greater detail coming up, but the RFP will be going through the task force for their input, for their discussion, for their comments, as well as a group known as the Silver Jackets that the Corps of Engineers uses that includes FEMA, FERC, DEC, and other state agencies. We want to make sure that when we come out with something that the state has been so gracious to give us the money to do, that everyone can use it, that it has the backing of everyone, so that the models, when they're developed, are accepted by all.
Thank you. And that's Ken Kemp speaking. He's our Director of Resilience at the Canal Corporation. I'll also note that Scott Rybarczyk is here, our Senior Hydrologist with Canals and the New York Power Authority. And Tim Walsh also joined us. If you're welcome, come on in and take a seat. Okay, I apologize. This is the most bland slide you'll encounter because I put it together as everyone was walking into the room. I didn't realize that the legislation that had been proposed by Senator Mannion and Assemblymember Serpy had actually gone to the floor for a vote. So please correct me if I have anything wrong here, but the legislation establishes a stakeholder group to coordinate water releases in the Oswego River Basin. As Ken, kind of foreshadowed throughout his comments on the Oswego River Basin, it's a scenario where there's no one entity that manages all of the flows throughout that very large, complex watershed. Canal Corporation really only manages a small percentage of the water that flows through the basin, maybe 10% or so. So this legislation puts the onus on Canal Corporation to bring together the various water managers, whether it be lake associations, hydroelectric companies, or others that have a hand in managing releases and rule curves across the basin to take a more holistic look. I think coupled with the work that we're doing around numerical modeling and getting that basis of data on the watersheds, coupled with improved communication, we're already going to be leaps and bounds ahead of where we've been in our understanding of the complexities of the watershed and where there might be opportunities to make minor operational changes that can have a big impact on downstream communities. So, thank you for your advocacy. This came directly from the recommendations of the task force, and I think is very responsive to what we've heard from constituents across the area. And I know a lot of you in this room showed up on lobby days at the Capitol. This has been a truly non-political, very bipartisan effort to make sure that we can do what we can to relieve this burden of flooding. So we thank you for your advocacy, and I think this is one very clear example of the outcome of this type of work. And in addition to, holding meetings and having improved communication, the legislation requires that we review the rule curves and water release procedures. We do have high flow management procedures. Might those be expanded to other areas? Those are the types of things the group can look at. The group is empowered to make recommendations to the governor and the legislature. And then lastly, in my 2-minute read of the legislation walking into the room, the group is also empowered to make recommendations around the initiation of a regulating district. So this group is a convener. It is not deputized with authority over other water managers, but can certainly make recommendations around what type of regulatory framework might help to further advance coordination across the watershed. Anything I missed?
Got past 4:30 Saturday morning.
Passed at 4:30 on Saturday morning was the comment. So congratulations on that, right at the 11th hour of this extended session. So thank you. All right, I'm gonna turn it back over to Ken.
So this is something we talked about during the task force before the report was submitted in July 1st, 2022. We submitted, Canal Corporation tonight was submitted a BRIC and HMGP application, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to FEMA for doing work on Fisher Ferry to attempt to reduce the ice jams. We've been working with Clarkson University for several years modeling this. And we have come up with a solution that we believe will, if not mitigate, significantly reduce ice jamming potential in that area. We have been talking with FEMA, and the status is still pending. We have a grant number, but there are groups that we are currently jumping through. For folks that read the Schenectady Gazette, there was a public notice there this week that FEMA asked us to place in the Gazette, stating that they are looking to give us the grant and asking for comments. So if you didn't see that, please feel free to look for it. One thing I will say about that, We took the public notice from FEMA as they submitted it to us. There have been changes to it. What they took was our initial application documents, and the height of the flashboards and things like that were taken directly from that. There have been design changes since then that were not included in that, but if anybody has any questions on what was submitted and where we currently stand on that, I'd be more than happy to answer them. The requested grant value, the total value is over $26 million. I'll turn this over to Bill Beckman.
Thank you. So one of the primary recommendations was that New York was, I should say, one of the weakest states in the nation when it came down to property disclosure for flooding. What existed until very recently was a form, a disclosure form, that if you've ever bought or sold a house recently, you would either have to fill out this form or the seller would have to provide the form, which has various questions about the condition of the house. And there's one question about flooding. Is the house in a FEMA floodplain? Does it describe what a FEMA floodplain is? But the penalty for not filling out that form is that the seller can opt out and pay a $500 fine, which might have been significant way back when that form was first developed, probably a couple decades ago or more, but certainly compared to the price of housing now, it's no longer significant. So 2 years ago, there was a bill in the legislature that recommended beefing up that form and also removing the $500 fine, making failure to disclosure basically liable for civil penalties. And in 2022, a portion of the bill passed, but it only applied to rentals, leased housing. In 2023, the larger bill was passed, and it was effective this past March. So now, if you buy or sell a 1 to 4 family home in New York State, the seller has to fill out a form, which has a number of environmental related questions, not just flooding, but it's really beefed up the flooding part of it. Is any part of the property in a FEMA defined special flood hazard area, which is what FEMA formally calls the 100-year floodplain? Is any part of the property in a FEMA defined 500-year floodplain? Is the property subject to mandatory flood insurance? And mandatory flood insurance is required of any property that has a mortgage from a federally regulated lending institution in which the structure is in whole or in part in a FEMA defined 100-year floodplain. Have you received any flood damage assistance from the federal government? Is there a current flood insurance policy? Is there a current FEMA elevation certificate? Have you filed an insurance claim for flood damage? And has the structure experienced any related damage due to seepage or a natural flood event? So the form is now available online from the Department of State. If you were to Google New York State property disclosure form, you could probably find it. But beware, you might find yourself navigating to the previous form, which might still be up there, not on the Department of State's website, but on some other entities' websites. So make sure when you look at it, it says revised 124 or later on the bottom of it. This is the form. It was effective in March. And there's a lot of public information that has to go out, not only how to fill it out, how to find the information that people need to fill it out, and what does it mean, civil penalties? There's no dollar amount. So I can imagine in future years, we might have some court cases that will try to define that. But for instance, if you buy a home, find out that it's in a FEMA floodplain, the previous owner did not disclose it, and you have reason to believe that they had knowledge that you should have disclosed it, you can take it to court to try to recoup civil penalties. But obviously, that's a court record that has not been established yet.
Okay, the next one is something I brought up earlier and was one of the recommendations of the task force. At the same time, we submitted the Fisher Ferry grant application. We also submitted an HMGP and later that year a BRIC application to look at flooding from Delta Reservoir down through Utica. I am happy to tell you that that grant has been approved. We have been issued that grant and we have started work on this project as Canal Corporation and NIPA. Basically, what we're looking at is any potential to operate Delta Reservoir in a different manner than it is currently operated. And also looking at, this is one of those bifurcated sections through Utica that just downstream of Rome, the Mohawk River and the canal itself are bifurcated. The Mohawk River goes through Utica and much of downtown. If you've been through there, you've seen the flooding that happens on during these events. We have guard gates on the canal that we drop during these flood events so that water cannot pass through the canal. Part of this study will be looking at how, if there's any way possible that we could open locks E8, 19 and 20 to pass flood flows through this area during high water events to try and reduce the flooding in Utica and the flooding on the main stem of the Mohawk. Obviously, we'll be looking at that, but also looking at downstream to make sure that we're not pushing the problem farther downstream. So it's a roughly $3.4 million study. We'll be doing bathymetric studies to look at what exactly is, how much floodplain we have to work with and what it's going to cost to modify our locks in order to get that work through. It should take us to a 30% design on a recommended alternative. And that would get us to the point that we could apply for another BRIC or HMGP grant for the construction. This past year, in light of what the task force recommendations, we submitted a BRIC application for one of the recommendations I mentioned, movable dam modernization. Again, it takes 72 hours for us to get these dams out of the water, which is great, but we have to have a 72-hour forecast to pull them out. Sometimes the storms come through faster, sometimes the storms don't come at all. We've got them out of the water and we don't get any rain, so we've got to try and figure out how we're going to refill those. So that's one of the issues that we want to address. As you can see, the damage from one of the storms when they were left in, millions and millions of dollars every time that they're left in the way of the floodplain. And looking at the benefits, increased reliability, increased public and worker safety. If you've ever seen them try to remove these, like I said, 1800s technology, they're what they call mules on top, connected to steel cables, and they remove them one at a time. It's a very slow, laborious process. We have unbelievable amounts of overtime and a whole team that has to go from dam to dam getting this done. So looking at modernization, we submitted the application this year for about $5.8 million. It would be to look at all of the dams to see what the best method to modernize them would be, and then take one of those structures to a 30% design for application in a future workaround for funding.
And I'll elaborate just for a moment on these. So you see a lot of applications for studies, and the note on 30% design. That's very meaningful because an agency, we typically don't engage in design work unless we have money set up for construction. So when we can access these FEMA grants that allow us to do the research, the studies, the modeling, and to enter into earlier phases of design, that makes us more readily able to apply for other federal or state grants when they become available. So I just wanted to put that in layperson's terms. It's something that's become more clear to me over recent years. So, you know, we're kind of building this inventory of design projects that are more construction ready and are thus better able to compete when other funding sources become available.
Another one I'm sure a lot of people in this room are looking for, we submitted a BRIC application for the study of Baldwinsville Dam. This would be to look at a method for lowering the crest of Baldwinsville temporarily, whether it's flashboards on top, whether it's rebuilding the dam and putting more gates in. Exactly what it would take, we're kind of open to anything that, and looking at any design that would work. We submitted this application to look at that. Developing the model is already taken care of. We're in the process of, like I said, that RFP from the state funds that will cover the entire Oswego Basin. That, what I did mention, I apologize for that during the, when we discussed that, was that model is going to be used for studies like this. How do we lower Baldwinsville Dam and what impacts does it have upstream as well as downstream if we can pass additional flows? So that's what we're looking to do here, incorporating the Oswego Basin model and taking it farther with looking at Baldwinsville Dam itself to see exactly how we can reduce flooding upstream and downstream. If it's, if we can find the benefit cost analysis that works on a selected alternative, again, we would take it to 30% design. And as Rebecca mentioned, 30% design opens us up to apply for another grant application from FEMA, either through the BRIC program or the HMGP program. BRIC program comes out every year. HMGP follows a flood event, a disaster declaration. They put 15% of the funds aside from a disaster declaration to support HMGP projects. We submitted this as part of the BRIC program. We're looking for both projects, this and the modernization. If there's an HMGP opportunity that comes up that has sufficient funds, we'll also submit there as well. There's nothing to stop us from doing this. If we don't get these this year, we will resubmit them this fall when BRIC becomes available again.
So another key term that Ken used is benefit cost analysis. So that's the ratio of the cost of the intervention to the total benefit that's accrued over the lifetime of that asset. So by doing these studies, the 30% design gives us a much better understanding of the cost element, that one half of the equation. And a lot of the work that the task force did in looking at the impacts across those economic sectors and across insurance claims tells us the benefit portion. So to what extent, and again, using modeling, if we were to apply this intervention, would the total accrued benefit be greater than the total cost of that intervention? So these are kind of the building blocks that we need to put in place in order to actually affect change.
And just to go a little farther on that, for FEMA, a benefit is only a benefit based on flood reduction. We can't take recreation, we can't take anything else into account. It is straight, how many homes do we take out of the floodplain? How many homes that aren't going to be flooded if it's operated correctly, that kind of thing. That's the benefit that FEMA, the only benefit that FEMA will allow. So it's directly related to the flood. And I'll turn this over to Thompson.
I think I see the green light on, so you can hear me, right?
Good.
All right, my name is Tom Snow with New York State DEC. We have a bunch of different things going on as it relates to flooding within particularly the Mohawk area, Mohawk region. We have a flood study that's ongoing through the Resilient New York Stream Study, which we launched several years ago. And during such time that we launched that flood study, FEMA has made us aware that they are actually updating flood maps for the entire, the flood model for the entire Mohawk main stem. So we've kind of paused at least for a little time to let FEMA go forward and do its updating of the flood model for the Mohawk watershed, at least the main stem of the Mohawk. So at this point, they're going to be coming out with a two-dimensional unsteady state model, which in terms of mapping people, flood people like me, is one more like the state-of-the-art model. So we decided rather than spend our resources on developing a model that FEMA was just going to do and probably do it just as good, if not better than what we were going to do. So we are waiting for FEMA to go through that process. Hopefully folks, particularly in Herkimer County, because I believe, and Kelly is here with me, that the floodplain maps in Herkimer County are being updated, but they're also too updating the entire model along the Mohawk. So we said, let's hold off on advancing the study in the interim to FEMA moving forward with that model. So it's our understanding that the modeling will be done basically a year from now. So we will take that information and then we will sort of hit the ground running. So we will then start doing our hydraulic analysis, our field investigative work. We'll certainly look into, what the projects that are being proposed by the Canal Corporation and see how those relate to flood reductions, at least a 30% design. So this will really be a nice culmination of all the efforts that we're doing right here, right now, today, and will be incorporated into this flood study under the Resilient New York Stream Studies program for the Mohawk. which is kind of a big undertaking. As you can see, it's a large watershed, and to do a flood study on tens of miles of upstream is a big endeavor. So again, we want to make sure that we're doing it using the best information possible. And certainly the work and the information that's going to come through the hydrologic model and maybe the bathymetry information, I think we'll have essentially a state-of-the-art hydraulic model for the entire Mohawk main stem, which in terms of identifying and evaluating flood mitigation strategies and projects and stuff, will be really extremely helpful in advancing and moving forward some of the recommendations that we will ultimately be proposing in our flood study. So there's a lot going on there.
Tom, just if I can add.
Sure. Go ahead.
We are, as Canal Corporation and NYPA, with the funds that the state has given us for those models, we are helping. We are going to be supplying additional data to FEMA. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. We are already going to come out of this with one model that DC, Canals, NYPA, and FEMA are all going to agree upon. That's going to be the best model that can be developed in a short amount of time using everyone's efforts and not duplicating efforts. Thank you to the task force for putting this together, because in the past that may not have happened.
Yeah, and I would just point out that when we first started initiated the flood study, FEMA had not made any decision. So, the fact that they did, as we were progressing along, to me was a good situation to have, that they were willing to come forward and really put some resources towards developing a state-of-the-art model for this portion of the watershed. In addition to the work that we've been doing on the Mohawk, if you're familiar with some of the other recommendations, there were 5 other studies that were identified as possible candidates for doing resilient New York stream studies, and they're listed up there: Owasco, Flint, Clyde, and somebody help me out with the other one. Glenargua, thank you, and Seneca. In Governor Hochul's State of the State, she did identify the Resilient New York Streams program specifically, and is providing additional resources towards that program. So I will be expanding the program by 40 more watersheds across New York State. So we will be looking at those specific watersheds to see for possible inclusion in the Resilient New York Stream study. Again, recognizing there's a lot of other initiatives going on. FEMA, to FEMA's credit, they're also updating a number of floodplain maps in a number of the watersheds that are covered up there. So again, we want to make sure we're using the latest and greatest information when we do our flood study. So if FEMA is in the process of updating their floodplain maps, we want to use that as part and parcel to our studies. So a number of the areas have been in a couple of the counties that cover the Oswego Basin have been updated or in the process of being updated. So again, when we go through our evaluation and analysis, we move forward with it, we will have really good updated hydrology and hydraulics to do our analysis as part of that. So there's a strong likelihood, I can't make a formal commitment here today, but a strong likelihood that we'll be able to move forward with some of those specific watersheds through the Resilient New York program. So that's a good thing. So if you happen to live in one of those watersheds, you'll likely be hearing from me again. And then lastly, as again was included in the flood study, or excuse me, the report, the Upstate Flood Task Force, was that Montezuma floodplain reconnection project that Ken mentioned. We're going to try to look at the different funding sources to see what possibly could be used to advance that project. And since we have not done a Resilient New York Stream study in that area, it limits us, at least, or since we don't have a full-blown analysis done on what the benefits of that project would be at reducing base flood elevations, we would likely have to do it in a couple of different steps, and perhaps maybe the first step being submitting for a non-point planning grant through the WQIP, which is out now today, for a notice of funding opportunities to do a preliminary assessment if you want to see what the benefits of that project would be, and certainly we can talk more about that. But then also too, looking at other areas within the Oswego Basin to look at potential other areas for floodplain restoration work as well. We've been doing a lot. I see Kristen Campbell is here from Oneida County. We've been doing a lot of work in Oneida County as far as floodplain restoration projects. They've really shown to be extremely effective at reducing flooding, and they're natural nature-based type projects. And they're also a multitude of funding programs that can be used, you can seek to apply for those funds. So there's a really nice lineup, if you want, of project type and funding source to be able to implement them. So I think going forward, we'll likely look at potential opportunities beyond just Montezuma, but other possible areas, maybe even on canal property, to see if there's possibilities to do further flood mitigation work from a floodplain restoration perspective. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Tom. And next we'll hear from Kate Black from the New York State Department of State.
So, my name is Kate Black. I work for the Department of State in the Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure, or OPDCI. We work with communities to increase their resilience to climate change impacts. The office employs key resilience principles to help communities understand the vulnerabilities, advance resilience measures that reduce risk, including through the use of natural infrastructure, natural processes, and avoiding investments that are not highly adapted to a changing climate. The office provides this assistance in ways that also acknowledge the added stress on communities from development pressures and broader socioeconomic forces. In addition to the resources and assistance we provided by our office, we are also integrating the resiliency principles and resiliency initiatives through all of our programs and funding sources. And Tom mentioned this too, but I do just want to kind of remind everybody that the CFA 2024 CFA is open and closes at the end of July. In particular, I would like to, kind of encourage everybody to review this year's RFA for the local waterfront revitalization program. This year we have just under $14 million available, with an emphasis on amending existing LWRPs to be more resilient, as well as a priority to work on the development of feasibility and designs for projects to build more resilient waterfronts, to prepare communities to apply for construction funding through the Bond Act. Numerous LWRPs and DOS funded watershed management plans are across the basins. So many communities are eligible for our program. Those communities who've not completed any planning with us, we do have information on our website to determine eligibility for our program. Additionally, we also have $2 million for smart growth, comprehensive planning and zoning. This can also be a really great tool for communities to encourage development out of the floodplain and more and safer areas. Also point out that the Department of State's Bond Act eligibility criteria is expected to be posted for public comment, hopefully in June, fingers crossed. Though during the comment period, we'll be doing a lot of outreach, encouraging communities and helping them prepare. But both of the programs the Department of State will be offering through the Bond Act are going to be centered on resiliency and increasing waterfront resiliency. And then finally, strategic relocation or managed retreat. I'm sorry, these people, I'm probably gonna use them interchangeably through this, but that's one strategy in an overall climate adaptation toolbox that can be used to build resiliency and lessen the risk of flooding. DOS has recently been awarded a contract to develop a roadmap for managed retreat. This project is partially being funded through a FEMA grant. Once the contract gets executed, we expect the project to be completed in 18 months. The development of the roadmap will identify and assemble the needed elements of a statewide strategic relocation program, including specific opportunities for DOS to support community-led relocation efforts. This would not be any sort of mandate. This would just be to help communities who are interested in considering this and exploring that option. And this is part of an overall suite of adaptation options that we want to help communities figure out where and what works best for them. The roadmap is a critical visioning and guiding document that Department of State can refer to, adapt, comply as needed. The outcomes of the roadmap will include resources for communities as well as guidance for DOS to support community-led relocation efforts. This is as I said, a necessary first step to developing a potential statewide strategic relocation program for voluntary local implementation.
I'm just gonna reiterate for those that are online, if you have questions, Shane Mahar is receiving those via email. It's shane.mahar@nypa.gov. As we open up the floor for questions, Mike Sullivan is gonna take the microphone around. We'll alternate between questions in the room and questions that have come in via email. Shane, please use the microphone when you're reading those out so that folks online can hear them. And just in summary, I think the word that kept coming to mind for me as we heard from the various agency representatives and subject experts and the work of our electeds is intersectionality. I jotted down this little picture of a house as people were talking. I think what we're doing around data modeling and some of these studies, you can think about that like building a strong foundation of a house. It gives us the basis on which we can build a stronger structure and fortify it. So I'm very pleased to see that work is underway as we pursue funds for studies and to create these cutting edge data-based technologies. And I in my work life, I always say, and now the real work begins. It feels like it's always the bigger thing is next. So success and motivation breed more of the same. So as we get this basis of data, as we come to better understand the structures that we can modify in terms of how we operate the canal system, then the work pivots to focus on implementation, securing the resources to do that. And, as Brian said, when we started out, this is our last required meeting. It is not the last meeting we will have. We'll continue to provide updates. We'll continue to look to you for advocacy and to show up on those lobby days and to write to your representatives, as we get a better understanding of what the levers we have at our disposal are and what we need to do to actually, press on them and make change. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. I'll take one from the room and then we'll pivot to anything that's come in through email. So looks like Jeff has a question, Sully, right in the back.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Coulter. I'm with the Central New York Waterways Association. At first, thank you. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for the results that we're seeing. Our community really appreciates what you've done so far. Looking forward to where it heads. On that note, the point you just made, Rebecca, now that the required public meetings are through, how will we in the community and those of us on organizations representing the community, how will we continue to get some type of consistent updates on progress or potentially lack of progress? And are there mechanisms in place that help you maintain that progress, hold you accountable to that progress?
So I can start out on that one. So the Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force website that we stood up for this effort, I'm going to stop screen sharing so hopefully people have captured Shane's email if you need it, but so that you can see us in the room. So the flood mitigation website is a place where we can put regular, updates. As the new stakeholder group comes into effect, I suspect it'll probably be subject to open meeting law. I need to look at that with council, but we'll likely live stream those and have access. So that's specific to the Oswego River Basin. And I think that there's efforts that have been a little bit more mature with the DEC and work they've done on resilience in the Mohawk that provide more of a culminating place for people to come together for updates on what's happening across that watershed. So those come immediately to mind. And, as you've experienced, if you invite us out for your lake association meeting, for a watershed meeting, we will show up and we're happy to have those individual conversations. We can connect via webinar, we can come to your community meetings. We do have regional staff as well as various subject experts who, not only work in these areas, but live there too. So we're happy to come out and meet you as well. Let me just pause and see. Shane, is there anything by email? Okay, Sully, John here in the second row, please.
John Harmon from the United Lake Association. I just wanted to, you probably-
John, well, for the folks online, you need the mic, so. So they might go bouncer mode on you and just hold the mic, so. Sorry if it died, you can take one from the panel table.
John Harmon from the United Lake Association. Really, this is just part B to the question that you just heard. Of course, we'd like to hear updates, but also the continued opportunity to provide input as well as this project progresses. I'd also like to reiterate that we thank this board and commission for all the great work that they've done.
Thank you, John. I didn't let the panel have a chance to respond on the other questions, so DEC, is there a mechanism that you guys have established where you receive feedback from communities on recommendations? And are there other places where we'll have public forums that I missed that you guys might want to add to?
So when we do a flood study, you know, as part of the flood study, obviously we do the engagement initially up front. And then we engage at the end when we do our draft final reports. And then one of the things I didn't mention is when we do flood studies through the Resilient New York Stream Study Program, we will likely have a specific funding source in the Bond Act through what we're calling the Resilient Watershed Implementation Grant Program. Specifically for those areas that are covered by Resilient New York Streams to implement projects. So there's that aspect, but then also through the Water Quality Improvement Program or through this new program that's been launched through Environmental Facilities Corp, the Green Resilient Watershed Green Resiliency Grant Program. So we're actually engaging with communities to get them that we have not heard from yet where we've done these studies. We are engaging with them again to get them encourage, incentivize them to move forward with some of those projects. So that's on the implementation side. So we're actively doing that. But if there's an issue or a question that comes up when we're doing a study, certainly feel free to reach out to me. As part of the individual implementing the program, or even in the future, like, hey, if there's a question or issue that comes up after the study is done that's not related to a specific project, I guess I am the point of contact for that.
Thank you for that. I think that also
Give me a call.
Yeah, there's an opportunity for us on the Upstate Flood Task Force website to list some points of contact. So Jackie Schellinger is with us today. She is our Public and Government Affairs representative for the eastern end of the canal system from Sylvan Beach and points east and north from there. And then Joelle Murney Carson, who I think has become a bit of an establishment for everybody in the Oswego River Basin, represents the canal system from Sylvan Beach and points west to the Genesee River crossing in Rochester. Having staff that live and work in those areas is really important so that we can be there. If the Stockade Association has a meeting, but we love to attend those and have taken every opportunity that's presented us to have those in-person interactions. One other project that isn't directly related to the work of the task force, but might provide a view for the data wonks in the room. And I know there's quite a few citizen scientists who've collected gauge data over the years and analyzed it independently. We are working on more software tools that can bring water management data into one consolidated place to be compared to watch in real time the gauge data from the various water bodies across the region. And we're working on permissions for a public facing version of that. So this is also part of that, thrust toward greater data transparency and sharing that not only across agencies, but also, with the public who's interested in it. I see Shane with his hand up in the back too from online, and do you have a microphone that you can pass to Shane?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Sully. First question online is from Jane Middleton, the Seneca River Cross Lake area. There's been a lot of talk about funding to do studies. haven't there already been studies done, especially on the Baldwinsville lock by the Army Corps of engineers decades ago? When can we expect the studies to be done and construction to begin so residents can start to breathe easier and reap the benefits of all of these studies and grants?
A great question. Bill, if you could pass the mic maybe to Ken, or if somebody else wants to jump in on that. I think the question of the Army Corps study from, I think, the 1980s on Baldwinsville came up for us a lot during the task force.
Yeah, the study that was done was an excellent study, but it's become outdated. It's very difficult to use that study, a study that's that old. The Corps would not use it either. We're going about this by attacking it, trying to get the funds as quickly as possible using FEMA. As many people know, canals funding has been slightly underfunded recently. We've gotten, again, another thank you to those people in the legislature for additional funding this year, as we try to move these forward as quick as possible. As far as when we can see something, that's going to depend on budgeting and whether we can get those grants. $3 million for operational expenses is difficult to come by right now. We're doing our best to do so. That's why we're looking for grants. We're also working with DEC and other groups to try and get these included as part of the Environmental Bond Act funding. We're trying multiple different places. We've got the application prepared. Now we plan to use it as many places as we possibly can to try and get funding. And we don't really care where the source comes from. We're trying to get the money as quickly as possible. But as far as a date for construction, I don't have one at this time. As an aside, we are talking at Baldwinsville, there's 2 hydroelectric plants. One is derelict, one is operational. We're trying to work with them to try and find a way to get additional flows through Baldwinsville using the hydroelectric plants. In the meantime, until those studies can be done, we're pursuing every avenue we can at this time. Unfortunately, I don't have a set date that I can give you, but we are doing everything we can to get the funding, to get everything studied, and to get the studies to go as quickly as possible. Once we have the funding in place, we'll hit the ground running. We have a lot of the information. We'll have the models, the HEC-RAS models, the basin, so that we can do that work as quickly as possible. We'll try and do what we can without the grants, but the grants would definitely help move it along with it.
Yeah, a few of the other words I jotted down as folks were presenting were adaptation, resilience, and nature-based solutions. So these are words that were not necessarily part of our collective vocabulary a decade ago or even 5 years ago. I think there's a much greater recognition of the impacts of heavier precipitation events from climate change. We're certainly seeing sea level rise, and people on Long Island are feeling that today, not tomorrow. So I think that focus on nature-based solutions, adaptation, and then the structural modifications is very encouraging. It means that we're all finally kind of rowing in the right direction, recognizing that the time is now. So we hope to see increased funding opportunities. As Ken mentioned, the governor included $50 million for capital improvements on the New York State canal system this year. That was also included in both one house budgets. It's nonpartisan. It's investing in our state's infrastructure, not just the Canal Corporation, but a state asset. And we're prioritizing those investments based on, kind of a matrix, but the top factors are safety and resilience. So we think about keeping the system operating. We're focused on water impounding structures. So our hope is that that becomes a recurring commitment and something that we can rely on. It's the first time the state has put taxpayer dollars, this is bonded capital, into the budget since 1992. So I think that collective recognition that this is an asset of the state of New York is very helpful. And I see a comment in the front row. Bring the mic over, please, and then we'll hop back to online, and then we'll go over here after that.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up real quick. Another mechanism that is kind of related to this is the open space initiative and the planning process that's underway within New York State. New York State Parks and DEC and a number of other state agencies are engaged with that. But looking at acquiring those open spaces in our plan with flood resiliency in mind. So, traditionally that process has grown. We are, in a lot of the conversations we had, certainly in our Region 8 committees, which include representatives from all the different counties, as well as from the different commissioner appointments. to really look at these properties and why we're acquiring them and how we can utilize them for flood resilience and flood mitigation. So that really has been kind of forefront of those conversations. It ties in a little bit with the conversation we're having here, in particular in the region that I'm the director for, is where we have Montezuma. And we're looking at how we can utilize some of those lands, federal, state properties in a way that helps mitigate some of that flood mitigation, components and ideals we laid forth in the plan.
That's a
And
great point.
Just to follow up with that, we know that there is no silver bullet for Cross Lake. Modifying Baldwinsville will help, but we know that that's not gonna be the only solution. Like Tim mentioned, the Montezuma area, we will be modeling that to see which properties are most beneficial, so that we can go after those on a case-by-case basis, but starting with the most beneficial to the producing flood.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I was thinking about that as we saw the governor talk a lot about open spaces. That might make us think about parks or just, forest preservation, but it's also seasonal floodplains. It's wetlands. It's, land that can be used for adaptation. So that's a great point. Was your question along the same thread, or if it's separate, we'll go back to the online question and then come back? And I think it was a gentleman here in the center. Did you have a question? Okay, let's go online and then we'll come back to the room.
Thanks, Sully. This is from Tim Johnson, Seneca Lake Pure Waters Association. Can you elaborate more on what kind of changes you're considering on changes to the rule curves governing lake levels? What's being considered?
And you want to start off on that?
Well, as Rebecca mentioned, the legislation to create that group is fairly new, a couple days old. We haven't really had a chance to look at the legislation or what it's gonna require. We haven't really considered what is gonna be looked at as far as the rule curves go. The initial discussion with the task force was there is a water level above the rule curve, but below the initiation of damage on some of these lakes that could be utilized in the short term. That's where we would start the discussion. But whether the rule curves get modified, we don't know at this point. We haven't until we get the model in place to see what benefits would be we could get from changing the rule curves. It really doesn't. I don't think we can talk about them too much right now.
And yeah, I would agree. I think it would be conjecture at this point. I mean, we know that water that released from Cayuga flows into Seneca, which flows into Cayuga and then passes through the Cayuga Seneca. When flood levels occur there, high water levels occur, everyone feels the impact of that. So we're always thinking about balancing so that no one's feeling, an unfair burden. And the modeling coupled with, that review of the rule curve is going to give us a much deeper understanding of where modifications are even possible. I have a question that sparked for me maybe this is for Tom. When you're doing the studies on the rivers, I saw that for anyone who's in the Oswego River Basin and especially that Cross Lake area, Seneca River and the Clyde River, people will say, why are you letting the water level rise? We'll have closed the dams and on the Cayuga Seneca, but water continues to flow in from the Clyde or from the Seneca River. How are those coupled? Because there's not a rule curve for rivers. That was a little bit of an aha for me as I got into this space as well. A lake provides storage and you regulate, the lake level within that rule curve. A river doesn't have a rule curve. It receives flows and, that velocity is driven by volume and the elevation change. So I don't know, Tom, how are those things coupled, the studies of the rivers and the lakes?
So you would look, so when we have situations where one river or one water body is flowing into another, we would, a lot of cases we're doing 2D modeling to determine backwater effect. So if one water body or one river is flooding and the other one is flowing into it, what effect that back, the flooding in one is affecting backwater in the other. So we routinely find that all the time, like a lot of work we've done out in Erie County, the Buffalo River, the Niagara River is affecting flows for Buffalo Creek or Cazenovia. So we would look at that as part of, while we're looking at one watershed, we'd also to look at the watershed that it's going into to see if there's influences from the flows from that on that particular and how those flows may be affecting flooding.
And do you look at sedimentation and the potential for dredging in those efforts as well, or is that something that's separate?
We're not, I mean, if from a sediment perspective, if we're not really doing sediment modeling as part of the HEC-RAS component, it could. We have done sediment modeling in some studies where, say like we have one, Shotwell Creek is going into Skinny Atlas Lake, which is an unfiltered drinking water supply. The emphasis on that was flooding and sediment transport. But as far as overall, we're not generally looking at that as the main, focus, but it could be, depending on if it's an issue.
Thank you. I see Shane has another question from email, and then we'll go back to the room.
Thanks, Sally. This question is from Mindy Smart. Thank you to the Upstate Flood Mitigation Task Force. You have all done a mountain of work, and like most infrastructure projects, it will take quite a bit of time to see any physical changes to the Baldwinsville Bladder Dam to alleviate the flooding we experience on Cross Lake and the Seneca River. It is disheartening to hear that the Canal Corp only controls 10% of the dams, but the brand new legislation passed this weekend is our only hope for some relief. How much control and influence can the Canal Corporation place on independent local municipalities that control those dams? And how soon will the Canal Corporation begin to bring together the other water managers? Thank you for all that you're doing, Mindy Smart.
Thanks, Mindy. Mindy always brings great questions. So, I was thinking about this throughout the presentations as well. It's, hot off the presses, but it's not a surprise to anyone that we need to get together in a room, and that Canal Corporation is certainly going to be limited because we're not an authority over those other water managers. But, I'm encouraged that the language, gives us that mandate to make recommendations to the governor and the legislature. Personal opinion, not representing Canal Corporation. I think people love the idea of bigger government in theory. In practice, maybe not so much. So if we look at a regulating district, what's gained and lost in that, what level of authority might a regulating district have over various water managers? How does that compare to federal energy regulation that is part of operating a hydroelectric project? So there's a lot to, kind of untangle there, but I think it's a complex problem that to me is exciting and, presents as much opportunity as it does challenge. I believe an earlier draft of the legislation I saw is that it mandated we meet within 6 months. I'm not sure if that's still the timeline. I didn't see it in the brief summary, but I also read it on the fly. But I think you can estimate that we'll meet within 6 months. We have to pull together the right water managers and establish that and get to know the legislation on a more granular level. But any of the panelists want to respond to that around the Oswego Basin and the stakeholder group specifically?
Thanks, Rebecca. So I come from Schoharie County, and the first meeting I had with this task force, I showed up in ripped jeans and boots, and because I was going to a work site that day. So needless to say, I try not to dress that way at these public meetings. But one of the first things I noted when they started to kind of brief us on, I didn't really know a lot about the Oswego Basin. I know a lot about the Mohawk. 85% of my county drains to the Mohawk, so it's our primary watershed. But they rattled off the list of stakeholders, and I came to realize that there's a lot of folks that have their hands in this Oswego Basin. In particular, that control the various hydroelectric facilities, impoundments, things like that. In my county, there's really two primaries. It's the Power Authority, New York Power Authority, that controls the Blenheim-Gilboa pump storage facility, and New York State DEP that controls New York City's drinking water. So we have a 20 billion gallon reservoir in my county. And of course, the fear is always a dam breach or something like that. But when I started in 2008, I don't know that those two entities really spoke to each other very much. But Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee was a game changer. Those two entities have transparent communications constantly on things like opening of Tanner gates, things like that. And it has vastly improved flood mitigation in Schoharie County on the Schoharie Creek, which is the primary feeder stream to the Mohawk. So when I saw that list of, I don't know, 8 or 10 different stakeholders, I said, you got to get these folks talking, because that's, so I was actually happy to see the legislation that Tom brought, and I applaud you guys for passing. I think it's really a good first step. And you know, kudos to the Canal Corps if they're going to be able to corral those folks and get everybody talking, because I really think it will help in terms of opening those lines of communication and getting folks to work together. I think it'll really make a major difference in water control methods. So.
Looks like Brian wants to expand on that. So Shane, we'll go to Brian. We'll go to question in the room, and we'll go back to email.
Just a follow-up for Ken. With $1.5 million approved in the budget proposed by the governor, passed by the legislature to do numeric modeling in both bases. I wonder if it might be helpful to give the group an understanding of what the process forward would be, how the modeling is going to take place, how long would it take, and then what are the next steps once the models are in place?
Great question, Brian. The first steps are we're going to do bathymetric surveys, which is a survey of the river channel itself and the floodplain along it, to make sure what we've got for flow capacity in the channel is what we have. Then we will take that, and as Tom was pointing out, 2D model using HECRAS. It's state of the art. We're going to take that model, compare it, build it using all of the constrictions and everything else, and the bathymetric study that's done previous to that. And we're going to build this model so that it as closely replicates as possible the Oswego River Basin. We'll calibrate it to previous floods. So we have the data that shows what elevations different locations reached during certain flood events, what the settings were on different gates, different releases from different lakes, so that we can get all of that in there to see how the system has responded previously, and then start looking at what can we change that would make this better as far as flooding in different areas. Same thing for the Mohawk Basin. We're going to rely and support a lot of the work that FEMA is already planning on doing. We'll do the bathymetric surveys there so they can input the correct data into their system, do some survey work, and also couple these with the work that we're planning to do at Delta Reservoir in Utica, as well as what we plan to do at Baldwinsville. Once the model's done, we can check all of these different scenarios that we would look to run. What if we lowered Baldwinsville 1 foot? Run it through and see what happens for different storm events.
So can we, the Canal Corporation, undertakes those studies, or is that what we're understanding here?
Yeah, the legislature provided the funding to Canal Corporation to do those studies, to do the work to build the models.
And I guess following up on that, do we have a timeline or expectation of how long it's going to take to do those studies?
We are shooting for 1 year. That may be a little aggressive. FEMA's got a head start in the Mohawk, so they should be able to meet they've already given us their schedule. We're starting from scratch in the Oswego, but the goal is to get it done within a year.
Thank you.
Other questions in the room? We'll turn the mic back over to Shane for the email question.
So this is a follow-up question from Tim Johnson. What can lake associations do to help? Rain monitoring, shoreline surveys, governing body, question mark.
I mean, I'd say one thing that's not on that list that you've already done to help is to have an informed and, kind of united voice in advocating for the measures that have already been enacted. So you have clearly, had relationships with your elected officials and have advocated for your communities. And, that means a lot. It's those voices, when informed and passionate, have a big influence. And so I would continue to exercise democracy as the first and foremost. Certainly monitoring. I know folks will reach out to Joelle when they see water levels, maybe on their end of the lake. Cayuga, for example, can be very different from one end to the other. So, if you're seeing actions that don't seem to jive, if we're withholding water at the Cayuga Seneca lock and, you're seeing water levels rising to a concerning level at home, don't hesitate to reach out where, Joelle will connect with subject matter experts like Ken, Jeff, Scott, who are here in the room today. And, we're happy to provide additional insight. Maybe we have modifications forthcoming. So, please reach out to your regional reps, Joelle in the Mohawk, or Jackie in the Mohawk Valley, and then Joelle in that Cross Lake vicinity. But is there anything else, from subject experts? Are there data points that you wish you had from lake associations? Are there particular points of feedback? I think communicating maybe with your county on zoning, if you see people infilling and you have questions about why that's happening in a floodplain. But Ken.
Yeah, there's only so many gauges. Like Rebecca mentioned, Oneida Lake, Cayuga Lake, they're huge lakes. They're actually impacted by the curvature here. We don't have gauges every place along these lakes. Cayuga especially, like Rebecca mentioned, we see a lot of differential. It's very different in Ithaca than it is on the north side of Cayuga Lake. What you see out there, if you can collect data, great. Whatever we can put into a model, whatever we can put into the system for controls is going to help us. Whatever you can do to support that is beneficial. And I know, Scott, being the new senior hydrologist for canals and NIPA, you have a lot to.
All I wanted to do is continue to echo those points. Your monitoring and already Oneida Lake has been great for us. Continue to reach out. Let us know when you see water levels that don't make sense. Our gauges are not infallible. So, sometimes we'll be looking at the gauges and say, everything's great. This is all working perfectly. And then we'll get a message from Joelle, hey, there's some water level issues. So please continue to reach out. We have a lot of great staff, but we can't be everywhere. So, your data is critically important for us. Thank you.
Scott, if you want to hold on to the mic, actually, I'll let Bill respond, and then I have a question for you guys too.
In terms of what other information, when a flood happens and the only thing affected is woods and unimproved fields, nobody cares. The water has to go somewhere. And if you increase the level or decrease the level of water somewhere, it's going to increase somewhere else. And there's a balancing act, which is going to be a very difficult balancing act. But where floods are a concern is when they affect infrastructure, when they affect homes, when they affect businesses. So I think a very key piece of this is to get the information on what buildings are affected, what roads are affected, where are the high water marks. If there is a flood event, make sure those high water marks are captured. That has to be part of it. And then as we go down the line, as we talk about resilience, as we talk about managed retreat, there are places where some difficult decisions need to be made about buyouts of improved property, elevations of improved property, so that people can be safer. The floods are not going to stop. Precipitation is increasing, both on an annual basis and peak precipitation. So simply moving the water around from one place to the other is something that needs to be looked at, but it's not the only approach.
Thank you, Bill. You mentioned gauges. Is there emerging technology that we could look at that could help us have better situational awareness? So I'm thinking about fiber optic and all of its detection. I just learned about this because of transmission cable. We can look at seismic activity. We can look at water levels. We can look at variation and change, temperature, saturation. Do you foresee that we'll use this emerging tech to enhance?
Any data we can get, we're going to use. So yes, we're already looking at a pilot project for fiber optic out in the western portion. If it works well, we would roll it into other areas. We're also looking at drone technology to look at things as well. If we can get a drone out there, to build on what Bill was talking about, photos are great,
You know, if you're calling me up with information and you can provide a photo as well, that is really helpful, because that really lets us know, you know, where is the flooding? Is it, you know, in your lawn? Is it right up to your front steps? Things like that are extremely helpful for helping us out. And again, that kind of ties into your question. Remote sensing is something that we're looking at. You know, is it a drone? Is it some other technology to try to help us get as much data as possible?
Any other questions in the room? Something like that?
I'm just wondering, we talked about the 72 hours it takes for the local dam to come out, and you also have to give notice in advance of that before you can start doing all that. With the potential for new technology, how much quicker can that process actually happen? And how much effect can it really have?
Great question. And depending on the technology, what we've looked at the most is pneumatic gates, like what we're proposing in Bishop Ferry. We're very familiar with those that have been used in the hydroelectric industry for a long time. It's basically an airbag behind a metal plate. For lack of a better term, the airbag inflates, keeps the pressure up, and keeps the plate up. So when you need to lower those, you basically are letting air out. It's the amount of time it takes to let the air out of those bags. You could, technically speaking, you could do it in 15 minutes. Yes. So that the 24-hour notice to mariners to get off of the water that there's a flood coming could happen. I would say that we could take that from 72 to 48 without any issue if we put press the pneumatic gates in all movable dams. If there's other technologies available, we'll look at them. I'm hedging on 48 because of the time it takes the water to move, as well as the potential environmental issues we could have. But even so, just moving it from 72-hour advance notice to a 48-hour advance notice is going to increase the reliability and really reduce unforeseen flooding to a much higher extent. And it's going to reduce the number of times that we release when we don't have to.
And for those in the Mohawk Valley, especially in the vicinity of the movable dams, when a big storm is bearing down, the last one was Henri that I recall seeing where we enacted the movable dam procedures. You can come watch from a safe distance, and what you would see is crews moving from lock to lock to lock, you know, dam to dam across the system, physically moving up there, taking huge chains, loading them onto the mules, these, you know, antiquated GE motors that are still highly effective at pulling up those metal plates, but that's a very manual process. I think people are often surprised by that. I know Colleen joined us to see the dams being put back in. That's another good illustration. So if you're part of an association that would like to see that or have more of a briefing, we can also work on putting together more short videos and posting those to our flood task force, you know, website. I know that's something that helps me a lot to learn as a non-technician. So I think I would like to just see our workforce not having to go out there ahead of a big storm as well. And, you know, we have safety measures in place, but it's still putting our workforce out there in not the best conditions.
Yeah, if you look at them, when you pass them on the thruway, you can see an operating level. It's well above those gates. That's where they have to do it. You'll see little things that look like a red train or a red caboose. That's what they are. They're a little, for lack of a better term, a little engine that gets moved back and forth. There's usually two of them on railroad tracks. And that's how those are, they contain winches inside that winch the gates up.
And there's a person in there. They're not operated remotely. So just to drive that home, it's a very, very manual.
I was gonna say, it's not one or two people. Jeff, is it, we're like 10 to 12 people, safety wise.
Yeah, it can be about a dozen. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Jeff, about a dozen. Any other questions in the room or from the email? Hearing none, we're at 3:38 p.m. We're happy to hang out and have some conversations if anyone has something that they, you know, didn't want to raise their hand and talk about. This meeting will also be posted on the Flood Task Force website within a few days. So the first 4 meetings are there and available with the material and all the Q&A. This one will be the same. So please make sure if you didn't sign in on your way in that you leave us your email address so that as we put out updates, we'll have that, you know, for broader updates as well. And just reach out to us anytime. We'll make sure that we update contact information on that website so that you have a point of contact in your area that you can reach out to anytime by cell phone or email. And please just keep the communication open. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us. I know you had other things in your lives and you took the time to join us today. I hope we answered all of your questions and that we'll have more to report soon. Thank you.